Hello, everybody. What a wonderful Saturday morning. I'm so glad you're spending it with us. I'm Nicole Franklin of Before You Go, the podcast, which you can find at beforeyougo.tv. That's beforeyougo.tv. I'm so excited because today we're going to expand on what we discussed in episode 3 of our podcast. If you're listening, which I hope you are, you know that we've done a number of the season 1 podcasts out of St. Louis, Missouri. I happen to live there and, be from St. Louis, and it's a fantastic historic city in many ways. We're going to learn more about that today. But one thing we discussed in episode 3, when we were talking to a retired nurse, Mrs. Glendora Hubbard, she was a retired nurse of the famous Homer G. Phillips Hospital, there's a lot of history in the Ville, which was a neighborhood in St. Louis, and we uncovered a lot of connections that she had through that historic place and the history of Missouri in general. And then I went off on a tangent and told everyone during the podcast how I am quite envious of one of the oral historians in town. Her name is Gwendolyn Moore, and she is joining us today. She is the oral historian of the Missouri Historical Society, which anyone can visit now that Missouri is opening back up. Let me bring up my partner in crime here, Cynthia Wagner, who is our Chief Marketing Officer of Epiphany Inc., and Gwendolyn Moore, who is the Curator of Urban Landscape and Community Identity. Hello, everybody.
Hello.
Hi. So Cynthia will be looking at the comment section, and she will be taking your questions for Gwendolyn Moore. And Gwen, we're going to just basically hop in because people don't want to hear from me. They want to hear from you, talking about what's going on at the History Museum. What is your role there? First, let's talk about what is your history with the Missouri Historical Society, because it's quite an interesting one.
Well, it goes way, way back to 1998, which seems like many, many moons ago. But I started as a research fellow, and it was just for the summer, and started in working on an oral history project that was pioneered by someone who was a mentor to me by the name of Jacqueline Dace. And she had this idea of doing an oral history based on 4 historic Black neighborhoods, 3 in St. Louis and 1 in East St. Louis. And I was hired to assist with that. So that was my introduction to oral history. I went to graduate school soon after that and was so intrigued with oral history based on my experiences at the Missouri Historical Society that I studied with a professor by the name of John Bodner, who, among other things, was well known for his work in oral history. And I worked for a brief time at the Oral History Research Center that they have at Indiana University. So when I had finished my prelims and passed my orals, I came back to the Missouri Historical Society and started working on oral history again. So I did 3 or 4 oral history projects. So I was well grounded in oral history. So that's how it all got started. And, we talk about how important oral history is. And I've always focused, for the most part, not always, on the African American community. Because being a person that's deeply interested in African American history, and until not so much today, but for a long time, African American history was not included in the broader narrative of the American story. And part of that was because people didn't think we had much of a history. We didn't collect things that would help us tell the story. In fact, that's part of my job at the Missouri Historical Society, is to collect things that will help us tell the story of African Americans. We sometimes historians are criticized for fetishizing paper because we rely so much on documents, and I think we're getting away from that for sure. And that's where oral history comes in. because when you
let's detail that if we can a bit. So your job, people think oral history. Are you interviewing people? Are you first getting public records together, then going to interview them? What's the process like? And I know it's we were trying to work out the number of years you've been there. Maybe about 2 decades, off and on.
Off and on, yeah.
Mm-hmm. And so yes, let's talk about the process because it's an exciting one for me to hear.
So yeah, whenever I get started on an oral history project, because of my historical training, the first thing I'm going to do is start doing research. You got to know what to ask people. I mean, and you want to know how their story fits into the larger narrative, how their story fits into the history of St. Louis, because I focus on St. Louis history, Black history. So I want to know how their story fits into the narrative of the history of St. Louis, how their story fits into the narrative of the history of Blacks in St. Louis. And I also want to know how their narrative fits into the larger national story. So the first thing I do is I start doing research. So that comes first, so I can have a real grounding in what the story is going to be about and how that person's story is going to be relevant to the larger story. And I think all stories are important. I think everybody has a story to tell. And the point is, we want them to tell those stories. Part of my work here is that I know that the African-American community has been neglected for so long. We don't necessarily have the papers and the documents that we need. We came late to the party as far as collecting those things. And that's why oral history is so important. If you can talk to someone like you do, Nicole, Black people in their 90s, I mean, 100, I mean, they can tell you the whole story from their point of view of what it was like to live in a segregated society. I'm really interested in that. What was it like to live in a segregated society? What was it like growing up? You know, just tell me your story. And that becomes so important to the story of the nation. And, you know, I always say, you know, the African-American story is the American story.
Yeah.
That's, you know, unique with me. I think everybody realizes that you can't put African-American history in some sort of separate bubble away from the larger narrative. We are the larger narrative. Our stories are interwoven. And so getting those stories from African-Americans, sometimes we don't have the documents. Sometimes we don't have the photographs. Sometimes, you know, we don't have the objects. But if we can get those people's stories, and that's also part of my job, I must say, whenever I get someone's story, I always ask, do you have something else you could give us that would help us tell more, amplify your story? Do you have photographs? Do you have objects? Do you have images? Do you have letters? Do you have church programs? Do you have flyers? Did you belong to a club? Do you have the membership roster? Do you have the minutes? You want to get as much about that person as you possibly can, because that helps me not only to tell their story, but to tell the story of so many others. And that's really the beauty of oral history. It is about that one person's story, but it is about so many other people's stories too. So that history is really so important. It's important for everybody, but for African Americans, it's almost, you have to get those stories. And what you're doing, like before you go, getting those stories, because we don't live forever.
Right. Well, and some of our guests, it feels like they do live forever, because like Glendora Hubbard, she just turned 105, and so that was amazing. I mean, you know, and she's like strong and kicking. Now, so let's talk about that. We interview people who are in their 90s, 100 years old, 100 beyond, and we can get oral histories from younger folks as well, I suspect, right? Especially in your experience that you've, like, what's the age group you're usually talking to?
Well, I think the youngest person might have been in their 20s or so.
Okay.
It's really, I was working on Through the Eyes of a Child, which was way back in 1998, which I said was my first oral history history experience working with Jackie Dace, one of the things we really wanted to do was get the perspectives of younger people growing up in these communities. And that was a lot harder than we expected, you know. And we were trying to say, well, you know, what's the problem? And Jackie felt that maybe they're just not ready to tell their stories. The other thing is maybe they haven't had enough lived experiences to want to tell their stories. But I think that's sort of an untapped demographic is younger people. And I've been thinking about that a lot, especially with the pandemic, because you're going to have a whole range of stories that deal with the pandemic and very different types of stories and very different types of experiences. Young people had very different types of experiences with the whole school thing, and at a time when they're very much focused on their peers. Then older people have a different perspective. Middle-aged people, teenagers, college students. Everybody has a different experience that I think is going to help us to understand what was going on during this particular period in history. And it's very important. And that's the other thing. I always say, you know, history is not always about, you know, just dealing with something that happened years ago. History happens now.
Amen. Yes.
And I say, you know, we collect history as it unfolds. One of the things when Ferguson happened in 2014, August of 2014, we realized we had to right away. We did have a Ferguson oral history project where we did want to interview people that were involved in that struggle. We had a Ferguson collecting initiative. Like I say, I also have to collect things to tell the story of what was happening in Ferguson. And we kind of expanded that to not just talking about the Ferguson, not just making about the Ferguson Oral History Project, but making it really focus on all these social justice struggles. And I hope that's going to be an ongoing project that we can really invest a lot of time, energy, and money into.
Oh, absolutely. One question concerning, let's go back. You're saying you're focused in St. Louis. I happen to have heard you talk about the St. Louis American, which is a treasured Black newspaper that's been around for decades. And we love that it's here. It's a very robust publication, you know, knocking it out every week, the story of us. And but you we're just diving into the research, especially with one of its founders, Judge Nathan Young. And please talk to us about how he shaped the narrative of how much of a civil rights town St. Louis is when people don't think of us that way.
Yeah, well, really, you know, I've been studying civil rights in St. Louis. It goes all the way back to about 2004. That's when the Missouri Historical Society actually contracted with me to do an oral history of the civil rights movement here in St. Louis. And that was really a journey, a fascinating journey. And I wound up doing another civil rights exhibition in 2017. And
I love that exhibition, by the way. I love that. It was so great.
Well, let me say that the inspiration was Judge Nathan B. Young, because when I started delving into the research, I relied so much on the St. Louis American and Judge Nathan B. Young. Judge Nathan B. Young came to St. Louis in the mid to late 20s. He was a Yale graduate, Yale Law School. He had grown up in Tuskegee, Alabama, where his father worked at Tuskegee. In fact, they were friends of Booker T. Washington. And then his father got a job at Lincoln University in Missouri. And when Judge Young graduated from Yale and went back to Alabama, found it difficult to ply his trade, his training as a lawyer. Plus, he got in trouble for his sort of civil rights activities. And his father, who was in Missouri at this time, said, "Well, why don't you come here? Come to St. Louis. There are more opportunities here." So he came here and helped found the St. Louis American newspaper in 1928. And the interesting thing about Judge Young, he was really interested in local Black history. And he had this fantastic platform, the St. Louis American. He was the editorial writer for, I guess, the next 42 years or so. So from 1928 on, he was writing all these articles and doing these editorials, and he focused so much on local African American history. And in 1964, St. Louis was having its bicentennial. So he published a special edition of the St. Louis American, the bicentennial issue, September the 22nd, 1964. I'll never forget that because it was so chock full of information. And, he had that banner headline, #1 city in civil rights, St. Louis, which, I think surprised people because we don't think of St. Louis that way. St. Louis was
That's pretty shocking. Yeah. To have,
yeah. City.
But I welcome that, and what year was that? Was that 64? He said was the #1 city and civil rights. Fabulous.
And he wrote this, and he laid out his case in this really long article arguing, 1964, we've had more civil rights cases go to the United States Supreme Court than any other city in the country, maybe with the exception of New Orleans with the slaughterhouse cases, but those were a series of cases. They were not, separate cases. We had 3 separate cases, and that was in 1964. And then in 1968, we had a 4th case go to the Supreme Court. And Judge Young wrote another editorial that was actually published in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch at this time. That was said, okay, before I said we were #1 in civil rights because we had 3 of these cases go to the Supreme Court. Now we have 4. Our reputation is cemented. We are the #1 city in civil rights. And so, of course, when I decided to do that exhibition, I said, well, this is going to be the title of the exhibition, #1 in civil rights. And people were going, I don't think so.
I think the title, Gwen, is what brought me to the exhibition.
Oh.
Obviously, I'm in close proximity, but I also was like, this one I've got to see. You've got to be, right?
Yeah, because most people were saying, this is, well, you grew up in St. Louis. You know how people think about St. Louis who grew up here. We think this is this terrible racist city. Black people are not particularly aggressive when it comes to fighting civil rights, which is, I don't know where that came from, but that was the popular notion. Because I'm gonna tell you something, when I first came back to St. Louis and I was doing that oral history of the civil rights movement, people would ask me, what are you doing over there at the History Museum? And I say, well, I'm doing this oral history of the civil rights movement here in St. Louis. And people would say, well, we didn't have a civil rights movement. And I was going, oh yes, we did. And didn't we have a civil rights movement? So yeah, that was I think that was for me was eye-opening. And I think I changed maybe a few minds. I'm hoping about St. Louis.
I think you did. Now, has any encounter surprised you in your one-on-one interviews, as the oral historian?
I don't know if one is really surprised me. It's really interesting. I'm sure you know this doing oral history. Once people start telling their stories, they continue to tell them after the camera goes off. And you learn so much more, and people will say things, people start trusting you when you're dealing with people, you're taking their histories, they get relaxed with you, they start telling you their stories, and then they continue to tell their stories, and sometimes they don't want to commit some of those stories to tape. So you're a journalist too, and you know that you have to respect what people tell you. If they say this is off the record, it's off the record. But it still helps you to understand more about not just that person, but everything that was going on around them. So it's even helpful when the camera stops rolling and they're no longer officially on camera, And I always find that I always learn so much from the people that I interview on tape and off tape. But I want to talk about this one person. I interviewed a 103-year-old woman recently.
Oh, we love that.
Yeah.
Who was it?
Yeah, her name was Angela Beckwith. But she grew up in Mill Creek. And So, I mean, she was, and I've been doing these oral histories on Mill Creek because that was the largest Black community in St. Louis that was destroyed by urban renewal in 1959. And my family had lived in Mill Creek. And I'm really been doing a lot of research on Mill Creek whenever I can get a free moment from my more official duties. But I want to make it part of a larger exhibition that I'm working on now that deals with segregation. So I was really excited to talk to this woman who lived in Mill Creek in the 20s and the 30s, grew up there, because most of the people I've talked to were much later. And to get that sort of first person testimony of what it was like growing up in this sort of thriving, vibrant Black community in the 20s and 30s. It was really exciting. So yeah, that was one that immediately comes to mind, because it's so rare, as you know, to run into people at that age that can give you those experiences that no one else can tell you about. And it's so much different from reading a newspaper account.
And I think they appreciate it too, just in sharing their story. I think it's something special. It's a moment. They can relive, wonderful memories, some dark memories. Talk about some of the dark memories that you've encountered.
Ooh. Well, I was interviewing one, this was back when I was working on Through the Eyes of a Child. And one of the persons that I was interviewing, really, he talked about a period in his life where he was molested. And it was like, I was so taken aback because that was so personal. And for someone to, if that was in the old days before we were videotaping, we were doing just audio tape, and it would just be me and the person in the room together. And that even made it even more of an intimate setting. And I remember talking to John Bodner, who I mentioned before, and I said, I really didn't know quite how to handle that. I mean, I knew how to handle it during the interview, but did he really want this as part of his oral history? And I remember John Bodner told me, well, he trusted you. And that's part of his story, that he trusted you with. So, you shouldn't have any hesitation about, or any feelings or hesitation about how they should be used. So that was one that has always stood out to me. Because
that is well, what people that don't do interviews and maybe look to us for interviews have to realize, it turns into a confessional. Like you said, you were one-on-one in a room, and at this point you had built up trust, and for something so personal to come out, and you have to empathize as well, but they felt that empathy.
Mm-hmm. And that's really key. I always say, I think I could interview anybody. Not that I'm that great of an interviewer, but I would say, I could interview a white supremacist. And I think I could make that white supremacist comfortable enough that he can say anything he wanted to, because it's not about me. It's about the person and their story. And, I want to get their story. And that's the important thing. We say it's a shared authority. It's about both of us. It's about the interviewee and the interviewer. But to me, it's more the interviewee. And I want to make my presence as non-threatening, as, excuse this reference, vanilla as possible. I want to fade into the background and let that person tell their story. People always ask me, well, what kind of questions are you going to ask? And I say, well, I really don't necessarily construct a questionnaire. I might have a guide,
right?
But it's where you take me. We'll start off with some basics, and then it's wherever you want to go. And usually it's not a problem, because people, once they start talking about their experiences and their lives, I mean, they know their lives and their experiences better than anybody. They're the experts. And so you let the experts lead the way. And so that's the way I handle interviews that I do.
The art of listening, a quality that you must have as an oral historian. We are talking today to Gwen Moore of the Missouri Historical Society. She is the curator of urban landscape and community identity. And we may have some questions that have come in. Cynthia, did you have questions that you're seeing?
Yes, I have quite a few questions that are on the side. So the first question is from Christopher Martin. Hello, Christopher. He says, I am a chef and I love history. Do you know the history of St. Louis style ribs?
Yeah.
And any history as it relates to St. Louis and food? And what about the St. Paul sandwich that he misses so much now that he's in DC?
There was an article was it in Sauce? I don't want to misquote get the wrong magazine, Sauce or Feast. We have these two food magazines, Sauce and Feast, or maybe it was the St. Louis. Well, whatever. Check it out online. They did a history of the St. Paul sandwich, trying to figure out where did this come from? Because this is the thing. We have all in St. Louis. We have all these little takeout Chinese restaurants, and they're very popular in the Black community. Any Black community you go into, there are going to be multiple Chinese takeout restaurants. And one of the most popular items is the St. Paul, which is this sort of like an omelet that's on white bread with lettuce and tomatoes and onions and pickles. Very popular. And
very good too.
And we know it didn't come from China, even though it's only served in Chinese restaurants. So they're trying to figure out, we're trying to trace the history of the St. Paul sandwich, and they think it came from St. Paul, Minnesota. I can't remember exactly how it had navigated from St. Paul to St. Louis and how this all happened. But yeah, that's and I don't know if that's really. It seems I can't remember getting a St. Paul sandwich anywhere else. Do you, Nicole, outside of?
Not outside of St. Louis, no, but I'm not as much as a foodie as people expect me to be. So I probably missed it. Please chime in if St. Paul sandwich is in a neighborhood near you, anywhere around the world, if you're watching.
I wish I could tell you more about St. Louis ribs. I know that they're very popular. I was, in fact, interviewing someone just on Wednesday, who started talking about Roscoe McQuarrie and and his famous rib house. And whenever he had people come here, even dignitaries, he'd take them to Roscoe McQuarrie's, and he talked about these ribs, and he would, how they do it. I don't know how they do it other places. I'm not as familiar. I'm a vegan, by the way, so I don't eat meat.
I was about to say, I thought you told me you were.
But how Roscoe McQuarrie made these, and everybody, you get this white bread, and you put this potato salad actually on the sandwich. You slap the ribs on there, or the snoots, or the rib tips, and the white bread, and that's part of the St. Louis rib story. I'm not an expert on food in St. Louis, by the way, but I think that's something that has been sort of bandied about here, to do St. Louis foods, and it usually goes back to the World's Fair with the hot dog and the ice cream cone and all that stuff. But yeah, Black, and a lot of my parents were from Mississippi, and I think there's a strong Mississippi influence in the cuisine in St. Louis.
I agree.
For example, sweetie pies with Robbie Montgomery. She would say that her cuisine was Mississippi inspired. So yeah, we have a strong Southern influence. Some people would argue, well, we are Southern, so of course we'd have a Southern influence.
Oh, definitely. Any long-lasting effects of the World's Fair, 1904 World's Fair, would you say have stuck around in St. Louis?
Well, I hope the architecture.
Yeah.
So I think we're grappling with the St. Louis World's Fair, because, of course, this was 1904, talking about a time when
people were literally on display, right? Let's just put it out there. There were people as exhibits in the World's Fair.
Know that the National Association of Colored Women's Club refused to participate because of the racism. In fact, we're in the midst of reinterpreting the World's Fair. We've had a permanent exhibit here on the History Museum on World's Fair for as long as I can remember. And it's going through some reinterpretation. I think it's going to be more forthright in telling the story of the World's Fair, the good and the bad. I always say you have to tell the good, the bad, and the ugly, because it's all history.
Yeah.
So I'm going to tell everything. And that includes the whole way that we looked at people who were not white or European, and the way that they were treated and the way they were displayed. So yeah. So whether they're lasting influences, I think there's always residual influences of history. History is one long story. It doesn't disappear. One era influences and impacts the other. And we're always going to be dealing with our history.
Yeah, I totally agree. I believe that there's so much that we can learn from our history, especially like things that we can improve for business. I learned that when I was going to college, because I asked that question, why do we have to take history? And he says, so that we can improve the future, and we look back to see what mistakes we made so we can make better decisions down the road. And also, I think it also affects us socially, so we can decide how to live better, how we can make changes, permanent changes for the better.
Mm-hmm. I absolutely agree. I love Judge Young. He's one of my heroes, my inspiration. And another person that I absolutely love is James Baldwin. And I always quote him.
Oh, me too.
The quote that's been attributed to him. I've been trying to find out if it's really true. But he said that you have to understand, if you want to understand what's going on behind you, you have to understand. I mean, if you want to understand what's going on around you, you have to know what was going on behind you. So if you want to understand what's happening right now, you have to understand history, because everything that came before leads up to what's happening now.
Exactly.
I would argue, and this might be off topic, but if you want to argue, if you want to understand a Donald Trump, you got to look at history, and that will bring you some clarity.
Yes.
If you want to understand racism and what's happening today, look at history. It'll bring you some clarity. You have a greater understanding. That's why it's so important to teach history, the real history, the true history, the factual history. History is not about fairy tales. Or as one man said to me, he prefers positive lies. No, history is not about positive lies. History is about the truth. History is about what happened. And we're only going to be able to understand what's going on now and move forward, because that's what it's about, moving forward, if you understand history. So I think that's why history is so vitally important. And that's why I love history. I think that's why we all love history, because it really helps us to understand what's happening to us right now, here and now. It's not just about what happened 100 years ago. It's about what's happening right now.
Well, I think also this brings up a challenge. You brought up our former president, and you really could see a lot of the past. It was his notebook. It was the playbook that he just drudged up things from the past, and they worked then, and they were working for him during his administration. I mean, and you can't fault him for saying, hey, it worked and I'm going to use it. You could fault the intent, right? But I think the challenge is, and maybe the challenge that the museum has, and you can educate us on how you're getting through this. How do we get people to listen? How do we get people to understand we are putting this in front of you, this history lesson, because it'll inform your next move, your choices, your life, and your productivity as a citizen? How do we get people to pay attention to our history?
Well, I'm glad you asked that question, because I think that's where places like the Missouri Historical Society and other history museums, the Smithsonian, all these museums, because we really focus on public history. We really focus on getting history to people. Historians do tremendous work. My brother's a historian. He's written about 35 books. Well known in historical circles, very well known, revered in historical circles, but probably nobody outside of academia knows who he is, even though he's written these powerful works. Because most people don't read academic books. They don't read academic histories. But at the History Museum, we take that academic history and we can reinterpret it or represent it in a way that's accessible. And, you know, when we do an exhibit, we want it to be accessible to everybody. In other words, we want a 12-year-old to come in and be able to understand what we're saying. We want a 50-year-old, a 60-year-old, 30-year-old. It has to hit practically every demographic. When you're talking about academic history, it's written for certain people and it excludes certain people, but it has to. I mean, you know, because it's written because of the way it's written. So I think that's the special mission of a historical society, of a history museum, is that we do make history accessible to people. And I think that's really an important job that we take very seriously here.
Oh, absolutely. Let's give a shout out to your brother. Have his name, please, and his position.
His name is Gerald Horn. He's a professor at the University of Houston right now.
Awesome. 35 books. That's that's something to be really, really proud of. That's fantastic.
37. He's always writing a book.
Oh, that's so fantastic. The time is leaving us. I want to give a shout out to my very good longtime friend, probably one of the people I've known the longest in my life, Erwin Smoot, I see, has commented. Erwin shows up at these live chats religiously. Hey, Erwin. The Smoot family is really big in music here in St. Louis. Would be remiss if we didn't mention the musical contributions that St. Louisans have made. And I believe there is a something of note coming up, Gwen, with the Missouri Historical Society, talking about the music here.
Absolutely. It's called St. Louis Sounds, and it opens in August, and it's going to focus on St. Louis's rich musical history. And let me say one more time, I keep talking about Judge Young. Judge Young did a lot of research on St. Louis's Black musical history. I mean, he was such a Renaissance man and had so many interests and delved so deeply into the history of St. Louis. And let me just mention, I always mention Judge Young, but, you know, we have other pioneering Black historians that I want to mention. One is Julia Davis, written so much and did so much research on Black history in St. Louis, and the other Herman Dreer. And there are others, but those, to me, those are the big three.
Oh, absolutely. I'm going to add my friend Charlie Rose to that as well. Not the Charlie Rose from CBS, Charlie Rose here, who is a St. Louis institution all of his own. And when he was talking about the Black Musicians Union that he did so much research on, that the Missouri Historical Society did a wonderful program on. Lots to discover. Cynthia, do we have any more questions? Oh, there she is.
Family is from Hannibal and also Quincy. And matter of fact, they said, Nicole, they love you and the family. But also, they also said part of the Blackfoot Indian tribe, which I am too. Hello there. I don't know who this person is, but yeah, I would like to hear more about that, because unfortunately, you know, that part of my history has not been passed down. And I want to talk about that later, about some of our history that has been hidden. But can we talk about the Blackfoot Indians that were right here in the Mississippi, around the Mississippi?
Well,
in St. Louis?
I must say that that's not a particular history that I'm conversant with. So
okay.
I can't help you with that one.
Okay. All right. Well,
that's something where, but where would we go and find out more? I think that's, we would have to dive into the archives.
That focuses on indigenous people's history. So right here at the Missouri Historical Society. And I'll give his name. His name is David Lobig, very, very knowledgeable, very well known, and just tremendous curator. And so I would definitely contact him, get in contact with him.
Oh, awesome. Yeah. So Cynthia and I both have to visit because, I've heard many rumors about my background. So I'll study the Blackfoot Indians, and I have to study the Cherokee Indians, and then and the whole mix that came through this Mississippi area.
You know, the Osage were very prominent here in this area.
Well, yeah, we are speaking on the land of the Osage, so give honor to them that where we are coming from today, for sure. And maybe we're mixed in with that too. So, so yeah, it's all a melting pot here in St. Louis along the Mississippi River. Yeah, we are running out of time. Gwen, I could talk to you. This. We have had to stop our own conversations. They get quite lengthy. But I love what you do. And I love what I do. I love talking to people, putting them front and center. We'll see one more time. Cynthia, is there anybody that also wanted to add anything before we close out?
Yeah, I have someone else who had a question about the food again, but then also wanted to say something. Before we go to that, I just want to say that, a lot of our history has been hidden and has been lost as African-American Black people. And that's why we have our podcast, because we are able to go back to people that we know who are older to kind of record some of the things, that we really didn't live because they lived that, and to keep that going. So that's why our podcast is so important. And I hope that if any of you out there has anyone who is in the age of 90 and above, it is so very important that you capture your history right now. Start asking these questions and make sure you record it, because our history needs to continue to go on, and we need to capture that. And we need to start celebrating those people who are wise and wisdom. They give so much wisdom to us. So yes, definitely make sure you download our podcast before you go. And if you have anyone that is 90 years old and above, please put it into our time capsule so that we can give them a shout out. And we'll be able to recognize them and celebrate them as well. And as the last question for the day is also from Chris, and we're going back to the food again. He wanted to know, he said also, he thinks that food played an important part in the civil rights movement. Are you able to speak on that as it relates to St. Louis?
I'm sorry that I can't talk about the relationship of food other than it sustained us.
Right.
Well, we also have farms here that we have a number of farmers in the state of Missouri that will always need our local support, and how we shop. Hopefully they've gotten federal support, but I know that we're a big farming state. And so I want to shout out to our local farmers who are doing the job, doing the work, and we got to support them for sure, because that's generational wealth there that is going to be hampered if we do not support.
Well, let me add something. My sister-in-law is with the Land Loss Prevention Project. And just want to say that Black farmers are losing land at an alarming rate. And I think that's something that we should be aware of. And I know the Biden administration was trying to make amends for that. And they're being fought on that. So I think that's something to keep in mind, too, when we think about Black farmers.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I mean, this time has gone by really quickly. I just want to thank our guest, Gwen Moore. Oh my gosh. Ever since I met you in person through our friend Michael Alexander, I've been so excited about your work and having you so close by, and using you as a resource, sharing with the Missouri Historical Society too. Loving that you guys love our podcast, Before You Go. Again, you can find us at beforeyougo.tv. And just really, really, really important that everyone visit the Missouri Historical Society. Please put it on your calendar. Make it a destination if you are coming from anywhere around the world. When you come to Missouri, when you come to St. Louis, please make this a destination. In your own lives, please, in your own lives, you have to know that what Cynthia was saying and what Gwen's been saying the whole time is that it's so important for everyone to record those who are your loved ones and your acquaintances in your circle who are of a certain age. But as we learned today, even in their 20s, especially as we have gone through this pandemic, what are they experiencing? And it's so unique to them and maybe so unique to their surroundings. And if we don't capture it, then that history moving forward is going to be lost in some parts that could be avoided, as far as some dangerous areas to slip into could be avoided if the future generations just knew about it, just from us documenting. So I always tell everybody, if you have a mobile device, you have your recording device. There's plenty of apps that are very easy to just press record and hit that audio button, and you're recording, and you can email it to yourself and to your relatives. It's such a treasure. Start there. We're really good with photos, but what are the stories? And photos tell stories too. So please, I'm not negating those, but photos and audio and video, of course. But something that's less storage is audio. Let's capture those stories. Tune into beforeyougo.tv, and you will hear how we do it. My co-host Bryant Monte and I, how we do it. Our team, Kristen Whitty, one of our producers, thank you for chiming in today. It was great questions. Cynthia Wagner. Gwen, any last final thoughts before we go?
I just want to say that I would really encourage people to consider donating objects, papers, photographs, a lot of things that I mentioned earlier, to a history museum so they can be preserved. What usually happens if those things get thrown out, and that's throwing away history. That's throwing away our stories, and we want to preserve those stories. It's just as critical to collect things that people hold dear to help us understand them as actually getting their oral testimony. So I always, let me just say, make that plea. Don't throw anything away. You know, call a history museum and say, hey, look, come out and look at this. Would this help you? And it could become part of a permanent collection and could go on display. So yes, that's my final plea.
I love it. Thank you so much. We have our instructions, and thank you everyone for tuning in. Please share a replay of this broadcast with friends. Please visit us at beforeyougo.tv. Sign up for our newsletter and you'll hear about more fun events like this. Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful, wonderful rest of the day.